Hello, everyone. It's so good to speak to you again. And today I'm very happy that I am with my dear friend Daniel from Germany joining us in this very important conversation, which is about forced labor due diligence and what it really means for companies which are based in the EU and have supply chains in India. We'll speak to you actually from both sides, from Europe, where Daniel is right now today, and myself in India, and share our perspectives about forced labor, what really happens on the ground, what are the expectations around these forced labor directives which are coming up, and some tips we can give for companies and suppliers to look for as the rollout of these directives happen. So Daniel, always nice to talk to you. I learn something new every time we speak. I'm sure today as well. From your perspective, sitting in Germany, and you're very active in the legal frameworks, how do you see this forced labor due diligence directive, which is coming up? And we have done few of these conversations before. Can you explain to our audience what are these developments and what are the expectations around them?
Sure, Rishi, and also very happy to have this conversation again. And of course, I always learn a lot with you as well. And it's very timely to speak on this because it's not only Europe, no. We know that the US already has a forced labor ban in place for a long time. The EU will have one that will start applying in the end of next year, but India also recently announced a forced labor ban and many other countries as well. So this is really a crucial global topic for trade now. Let's look a bit on what's happening in Europe. So some basic facts that you might know or you might not know, but so basically every import to the EU, every export from the EU, and also every making available on the market in the EU, meaning a German company selling something to a French company, for example, are in scope of the EU forced labor regulation. So they all need to check if forced labor is happening in the supply chains. And another important thing, it's not only the big companies. Every company is in scope. Every company doing this has these obligations. So it's a really big topic. This will be huge. And if you look now, where are we at the process? So the European Commission will be the main entity to control this together with the member states, but let's not go into the details. Basically, it's the European Commission, and they released a guidance right now on the EU forced labor regulation to explain what is really expected from the companies, what is really expected from the authorities that implement this. And it's a very interesting guidance document that I recommend reading. There are some very interesting questions, and they are very, very relevant for practice. One particularly is super relevant. The question is, do you really have to guarantee that your whole supply chain is free of forced labor? Or do you have to show that you are taking good due diligence measures to go against forced labor? And this, but we will talk about it later, this is a very complex question because it has many implications. And to be honest, legally, different interpretations are possible of the EU forced labor regulation. The guidance itself is confused about this, I would say, because they say in one part, it's an obligation of guarantees. And if there's any adverse impact of forced labor in the supply chain, you cannot make the product available in the market. That's the one side of the guidance. On the other side of the guidance, it says, look, here's a whole chapter for the companies. What's your due diligence that you have to take? And it says things like responsible exit as a last resort, continuous improvement, prioritization. And the guidance also says, very interestingly, that when the European Commission is investigating a company and the company shows that it is already taking good measures to end the forced labor situation that is being investigated, then the European Commission can decide to not impose a forced labor ban on this product. So if you have a product, for example, let's say it's sugar from India, and they are like, okay, sugar from India, we know in this region there's forced labor, we have an NGO complaint, it shows there's a problem. And then you say as a company, yes, but we already have the program in place, we know about this, and we are fixing it right now with rights holder engagement, for example, with an expert on the ground like Rishi, then you have a chance, according to this guidance, to avoid the ban. But it is really early stage in this, and I would personally say that the best legal interpretation is saying like asking the company, what are you doing? Okay, it's not finished yet, but you're work in progress, so you can continue to do business, because anything else, as we will see in our conversation as well, will be very harmful. But what is happening in India, Rishi? New stuff that's been happening in India.
Thank you, Daniel. Certainly on India's side also there's significant developments as India has signed free trade agreements with many leading economies of the world, which is great for Indian businesses. India is also very much aligned with what is happening across the world. And recently, India also prohibited and banned imports of goods which have been made by forced labor. And we are awaiting more details on it, on how this will be rolled out. But certainly, the government has taken a very important step. Also, forced labor, what I'm seeing as a practitioner, is becoming from a human rights or an intellectual subject or a compliance requirement to a trade issue now. The work I do in various supply chains, meeting suppliers and many companies in Europe, there are some increasing questions which are coming around suppliers in terms of how the recruitment happens of workers, what is the situation with migrant workers in the supply chain, how are the labor contractors really managed, how is the worker documentation done, and things around overtime and grievance mechanism, and the whole aspect about vulnerability. And so some questions have started coming in, and what we are observing on the ground that there would be certain areas where companies will find that there are areas to improve and to engage with suppliers. Today morning, I was talking to a supplier where there's excessive overtime or there's unpaid overtime on premium level, and there is a lack of a holiday or a weekly off for workers who are working straight off. These are very common things which are there in the supply chain at this point in India, and this is faced by many suppliers. And I think there is a need for a transition. How can European and Indian companies not only do this trade and business, but how can they come together in terms of rollout of these new directives which are coming in? And as we've seen in the past, Daniel, you and I have discussed a lot on this, that the previous compliance models have not yielded much results. They have only increased the audit burden on suppliers. So I'm really looking forward to actually creating a new change or a new wave with these directives where we could really look at a more positive engagement on the ground. And that's something I would really love to talk to you about as well. But in India right now, I think only few people are speaking about these directives. I think it's going to grow next year when it comes into full force. But coming back to you, coming back to Europe, I know you are a champion for change. You want to do this work because you want to really see positive change on the ground in supply chain. So there are two aspects I'm looking at in that change model. Is one is how do large companies prioritize their large supply base, which could run into thousands of suppliers. And second is about how do we do effective supplier engagement. I think there are two main aspects which are coming out in terms of creating impact on the ground. How do you see it, Anil?
Thank you. Let's discuss on that. Definitely big challenges. So I mean, the first question for me is always prioritization in all my human rights due diligence work. And it's a question, of course, everyone says, yeah, prioritization, prioritization. But the problem is doing a very good prioritization is not so easy. Because if you just like at the mass of your suppliers and say, okay, these are red suppliers, yellow suppliers, green suppliers, you and I have talked about this. Often you're like, okay, this is kind of stupid, superficial information. What should I do with it? I don't think this is the right approach. I think what you should do is rather think about product categories. Because, I mean, let's say you have 10,000 suppliers, but you have only 600 different products only. It's still a lot that you buy, no? So this is something you can work with more easily to prioritize. Saying not like, okay, which are the red suppliers? Because let's be honest, this information of the red supplier from your IT tool or from your Excel questionnaire. Normally, it's a superficial assumption that is far away from reality. That's not effective risk analysis. That's just a pretense. But if you focus on the products and in the future, the European database, there will be a database, a forced labor database, will give you data on the product risk, on the regional risks. And then you can say, okay, I have 500 products. Let's map them on the forced labor database. Let's see which of these, which are the 50 products that are most risky on forced labor. And then let's first try to understand before we start acting like crazy, doing some things, sending questionnaires or whatever. First think, okay, this is my product. What's the typical supply chain of my product? How does it look like? Like not the actual supply chain, like really identifying the tier two, tier three, tier four. That's also sometimes important, but that's a lot of work. And that's not the first step. That's maybe the fifth step. Yeah. The typical product supply chain. So if we are in a product like, let's say, a nice chocolate, and then I identify, okay, one component is cocoa. We have a risky supply chain there to Ivory Coast, let's say, also in terms of forced labor, child labor. And the other one is sugar. And let's say, okay, it's a forced labor, high risk in India, in my Indian sugar supply chain. This is the first mapping that you should do. And then you should start to decide where to focus. Do you want to go first up to the cocoa, or do you want to first go to the sugar? Yeah. And then you should take in-depth actions. But there's one problem with this. This is related to what I said with the legal question. Yeah. Guarantee no forced labor, or guarantee I have some good measures. If you prioritize sugar and not cocoa, and then you have forced labor in cocoa, it might be that they will stop your imports. And maybe you can defend yourself. You can try to defend yourself. Say, no, 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 we prioritized sugar. But this will be very hard to argue. Most likely, if you said we deprioritized completely cocoa and only focused on sugar, they will say, well, your problem, we will stop the cocoa exports, cocoa imports, and you have a problem. So at least you have to be prepared to take measures very quickly, also in sugar. But it might be that this is not enough. This is a real dilemma. This is not an easy regulation, because you need to focus on some products to do meaningful work. You cannot do everything everywhere all at once. But it's not clear if you have that room under the regulation. Yeah. It's likely that they will say, we will stop your cocoa unless you can show us that you at least started taking some measures if there's forced labor in your cocoa. But one thing you shouldn't forget. There's two different situations. One is the European Commission looks at the database and says, it's a risky product, I want to see your measures. Okay. But there they don't know about an actual violation. So you don't necessarily have to prove that you did remedy. The other case is the NGO comes to the European Commission, says, there's a problem in your sugar supply chain. We know this is your supplier of sugar. Here's the forced labor indicators. We talk to the rights holders. You should stop this. Then the European Commission will ask you to stop this. And if you did not stop it and you cannot stop it, then the import will be stopped. Not easy.
So there's many dimensions and many layers to it, and I think with time only we'll get better sense on how these criterias play out as
Exactly.
as you have explained to them.
But Rishi, can I ask you one thing before we talk about the supplier engagement? Because that's something that we should definitely discuss. But what do you think? Let's take the sugar example. Where do you see this role of rights holder engagement? Let's say I'm a German supermarket, I prioritize the Indian sugar, and now what next?
That's a very good question, and I think it requires this practical understanding of what happens on the ground in India. And I would say the more formal, organized supply chains, as the ones we're talking about right now, forced labor is not very obvious that we will go to a factory and we'll probably spot forced labor right away. I think there's a lot of shades of gray when it comes to forced labor and situation on the ground. So context matters a lot. So when you talk about a certain things like cocoa and sugar, and these are the agriculture commodities, and they would be commodity which are engineering commodities and pharmaceutical commodities. So the context will matter quite a lot. And I think understanding that context in which these supply chains operate is super important. So how do we understand the context is actually talking to workers. I think the directive would have the real benefit when it enables worker engagement on the ground and understanding their lived realities. In the supply chain, you have mentioned there are millions of workers who work in that space, and they're of different levels and different tiers. There are casual workers, migrant workers, permanent workers, union workers, and everybody's situation is a bit different. So the vulnerability is understood by actually talking to workers. That's something we do with a lot of passion and with a lot of rigor in understanding what is happening on the ground. We have experienced when we have gone to certain factories and we have spoken to factory managers. We don't do any audits, we do more open engagement. Companies have told us about certain issues they face, things like withholding of local documents by contractors. There is some recruitment practices where there is some money transfer happens, but nobody has a trail of it. Freedom of leaving employment and going away, although it is very clear, but the situation of workers is such that it leaves them with very few choices and they have to work in a certain constraint. For example, excessive overtimes or working on weekends and not having any break in place. And we are also seeing the biggest, I think, the gold in what we are seeing on the ground right now. The perspective between the management and the workers is different. Management think they have great policies, systems, and procedures. When we talk to workers, their lived reality is very different. They can't use the grievance mechanism and they don't have proper safety equipment and they're doing overtimes they don't want to do, but they have to do because there is nobody they can raise a grievance to. And I think with women joining the workforce quite a lot, there is another dimension of vulnerability where we're looking at women joining factories is a new thing in India and it's becoming more and more, which is really great. But it also increases vulnerability at workplace. And I'm seeing that increasing quite a lot. There are also things like excessive heat, climate change, heat impact, all of that, as we know, across the world, it is happening. It's happening a lot with workers. It's a new type of vulnerability. What do workers do in such situations? And what I've learned in my 25 years is although this is a forced labor directive, you cannot just separate it out with other rights which are there. It's
Yeah.
very intertwined,
Yeah.
more like a fabric. And I think this would be a
Mhm.
driver. This direct would
Yeah.
be a driver taking us into
Yeah.
understanding other working conditions and making lives of people better in the supply chain. So this is what I am seeing on the ground.
I wanted to say about these, what you're saying is a very important point that also comes up in my conversations. Right now, there's a bit of a backlash against the German Supply Chain Act and the CSDDD. So the scope is being lowered. Some companies will not be obliged in the future under the German Supply Chain Act, some smaller. So some companies are already thinking, should I dismantle my human rights due diligence work? But some customers that I work with told me like, look, this would be not very intelligent because we have our requirements and it's not just forced labor. It's in the supplier code of conduct and it's all the requirements. Yeah, because we are obliged by it or because we believe it's the right thing to do. And this is happening all around the world. So right now, what you are saying is very correct. Like you should not go when you look, you will have to look for the forced labor thing, but you should not look with a tunnel. You know, in Germany we have this thing like looking through a tunnel, not just the forced labor tunnel. You have to look at the sites as well because your customers and your investors are asking you to do that. So don't fall into that trap to say, okay,
Mm,
rather say it like this, we will focus on the forced labor and then we will also look at the other things as well.
Yes, no, absolutely, absolutely. I think that broad vision is needed. I engage with a lot of suppliers on the ground. A few days back, I was talking at a large forum in India that my learning has been no supplier wakes up in the morning thinking that they don't have to do a good job or they will make lives of people difficult. I think all suppliers, especially linked with global supply chains, want to do the right thing and they also want to improve over time. Unfortunately, there are times when they have to hide issues. And forced labor is one of those issues. It's not very tangible. It can be hidden very easily. They hide issues not because they don't want to improve. They hide issues because they don't know where to ask for help and for guidance and to where to go to improve. And I think that's what I'm observing on the ground. So that brings us to this whole supplier engagement piece, right? I feel that is at the heart of this directive. How do you see this supplier engagement happening from a European point of view? In specific German point of view, I've worked with German companies before. I'm quite a big fan of German collaboration with their suppliers. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, so this is really, I agree. This is for me, maybe this is maybe this is the most important issue of them all, no? So Let's say what I see right now, also under the German Supply Chain Act, German companies are not the perfect buyers for the suppliers in the sense that they, let's say, okay, they pay super good prices, responsible purchasing, and so on. Some do, some don't, no? But normally, German companies, if problems occur, they will take a collaborative approach because this was also emphasized a lot by the regulator. You have to do continuous improvement and the responsible exit as a last resort. So it's like the end of a whole escalation, and you try to talk with the supplier, you try to understand the problem, you try to improve the situation, unless it's a very, very grave situation. No, let's say like state-imposed forced labor, German companies will just go out often. No, but if it's not that, normally they will engage and try to improve together, and also in forced labor. I mean, if you talked about the forced labor indicators, so there are many, no, and it can be excessive overtime, for example. Yeah, if you encounter excessive overtime, you should work with your supplier to improve the situation, understand why this is happening. Maybe it has something to do with my ordering behavior. What is your economic reality? What's possible for you? How can you stepwise improve? No, that's normally the mentality also. I would say that is getting stronger. Yeah, although we also have this mentality, of course, like you have to tell me no risks, no violations. You have to sign the contract and say there is everything is fine. You just have to pretend. Then I will send you a questionnaire and you will say, yes, I respect all the laws. And then I will just pretend that everything is fine. This is also happening, no? But this is the bad practice. And I feel that it is getting weaker. And the more, and it's getting stronger now, the more engaging, honest practice, saying like, look, we know there are problems. Let's not lie to each other. Let's be good business partner, honest business partners. Let's first talk about reality and then what we want to do with it, not pretend that it's not there. Now I see a big risk with the forced labor regulation, and this is related to what I said before. If this forced labor regulation is interpreted like this, saying like, look, you German company, you are importing stuff from India. If there is a forced labor violation in that supply chain, we will stop your imports. What will the German company do? It's in a very tough situation. On one hand, it knows I want to be a good buyer, I want to have a good buyer supplier relationship. It's not only about the human rights aspects, no? So I want to be a fair business partner so that my Indian supplier gives me also a preferred status, is reliable. I have a resilient supply chain. I can depend on them. If some things go wrong, we will still have a stable relationship. No? And in terms of human rights, I want to have an open, honest relationship where they tell me about problems so we can fix them together. That's one interest. But the other one is if the import ban happens, I will lose the goods. Who will pay? Oh, it's a problem in the supply chain of the supplier. Let's push the economic risks to them. How do we do it? We put in a termination right, immediate termination right, if there are indicators of forced labor, zero tolerance. That's the risk that I see because this is, as you said, this would reinforce this problem that you described, that suppliers are unwilling to. It's not only they don't know where to go for help, they know that if they share about problems, if the audit, if the rights holder engagement, if the questionnaire shows there are problems of forced labor, they risk their whole business. So what will they do? They will shut up. They will not be honest. So the human rights due diligence will be damaged and the trust in the relationship will be damaged. That's for me the biggest problem that I see. Well, I agree with you. I like the fact that we are having these forced labor bans more and more because I think it is very important. It should be a priority for business to prevent the forced labor. But sometimes the perfect is the enemy of the good. And if we don't handle this well, this could be the case. But what do you think?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's going to be quite a dilemma when these things come up. And I can only talk about what would work with suppliers and what I'm seeing already some German companies doing with whom we are working with. I think the aspect about supplier engagement is going to play a vital role in the rollout of these directives. And in that, having an open conversation with your suppliers, meeting them in person, online, but having a very non-audit or non-compliance conversation and saying, these are the new requirements, we are together in this, and we need to find a way that we reduce our risk. I've been in these meetings with suppliers and companies, and I've seen very constructive, open conversation happening and problems being kept on the table to understand what can be done about it. So that's number one of it. The number two point is about training and awareness. I see many suppliers don't know about these directives which are happening, yeah, especially in Europe. Even like the forced labor indicators from ILO are not fully understood at factory level or at a farm level. And there is a need to give them some information. Thankfully, today with technology, it's easier to send information to suppliers and let them know what these forced labor requirements look like. There are certainly some paradigms around it because India had a colonial past and we look at forced labor through our colonial lens. Although in the modern world, forced labor plays out very differently than it did in colonial times. So that's number two of it. Number three about is having like starting due diligence, looking at again engaging workers, going on site, looking at where the risks are, not sending auditors straight away. And I had a friend who spoke about in another conversation, and she said sending auditors to your suppliers when you have a critical thing to talk about is not the right thing to do. I totally agree. And so sending people who understand local context, mapping out vulnerabilities, workers, suppliers, subcontractors, etc. Yeah, I think is very important, and companies will need these kind of engagements with their supplier to actually roll out. Otherwise, it's going to become another compliance model, and it's going to be pushed down the throats of suppliers. And we all know that model has not brought much value to companies, and their cost of doing business is only increased by looking at those compliance models. And nobody wants to increase costs in today's world, in a
Yeah.
much more volatile and difficult world we are living in. So this is what I'm observing on the ground. But from your perspective, what
Mhm.
advice would you give to German businesses or European businesses as we bring this conversation to a conclusion? Any quick advice you'd like to give them?
I mean, one thing, like also a bit of reflection on what you are saying, there's one thing you said this, like pushing this down the supplier's throat in a compliance model. There's one additional risk to this. The question is, what do you think, like as a company, what will work to really reduce the forced labor in your supply chain? Because you can paint a nice picture and have a pretense and say like, okay, everything is perfect, and we have the questionnaire that says everything is perfect. We sent an auditor and there were no forced labor indicators because they didn't talk to the workers. Yeah, everything was good. Can have this pretense. The NGOs are smart and will go after you, and they will identify this. They will bring these cases to the European Commission and to the member states, and then your imports will be stopped. Maybe not in the beginning, but later. So having an effective due diligence system for forced labor will also reduce your risks. In the end, even if you think in the beginning maybe it's a problem because we cannot terminate immediately with the supplier. Yeah. But this is also an investment in your economic resilience on the long term. So that's one reflection on what you said. And I also think that you have to take into account, I'm working on some of these cases also with companies, forced labor in the deep supply chain. This takes a lot of time. This takes a lot of trust building. Why were the suppliers open, as you described? Why were they open? Because the company was also open to require continuous improvement, to require obligations not only for the supplier but also for them of cooperative behavior. So they created an atmosphere. They went there not with audits, but they went there with workshops to explain to the suppliers, to share with them. And this really created the basis for improving these things. I mean, you will not solve the tier N issue overnight, the tier N forced labor issue at the raw materials thing. So yeah, my reflection to the companies would be to do the prioritization early, to think about what your critical products are in terms of forced labor, invest in the supplier capability, invest in the awareness, as you said, but also to the European Commission and the member states, be realistic. Don't be like perfectionists. Don't go with the zero tolerance approach. Go with the continuous improvement mindset and let the companies have the space to improve together.
Absolutely,
What do you
absolutely.
think?
Absolutely. No, we're almost on time and we can probably go on forever. Maybe we could do another part two of our conversation where we look at some examples on the ground. We had a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Daniel, for being here. I always enjoy speaking with you. Time just flies when you are
No,
here and in the conversation. But I will leave with a parting thought to companies and to suppliers. And I think this new directives which are coming in would require to reduce risk in the supply chain. And that would be done by two main approaches. One is about understanding the legal requirements, which you spoke quite a lot. And the second is about due diligence, which is talking to workers and understanding their realities. I think then only we can create a more robust supply chain, which we intend to do with these kind of new directives. So my request to companies is educate your suppliers, engage with them, start talking to them, having calls, or if you're visiting India, please do drop by and say hello to these factory owners, which are mostly family run businesses, and try to make them understand the why. I've never seen any Indian business owner, if they've understood the why of it and why this is needed, they won't stand behind it and they would not put their efforts behind it. And I think that's what many more companies can do, is kind of some of the examples we are piloting on the ground. So I look forward to the rollout, which happens next year, and then more conversation on this topic, Daniel. Good luck to you. More power to you as you're holding your station in Germany. Thank you very much, everyone who's listening and joining us today.
Thank you, Rishi. And also looking forward to see how the Indian law will play out. And take care, Rishi. Always a great pleasure with you.
Thank you, Daniel.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.